my name is Nadia Maxwell. I am a dietitian, intuitive eating counselor, credentialed eating disorder clinician, and clinical hypnotherapist. And I am thrilled to be here today for Manage Endo. And I'll be talking all things nutrition, endometriosis, and pelvic pain. I'll introduce myself a little bit further in a second, but just a few formal things to kick off. So, the usual Quendo disclaimer. And then, of course, an acknowledgement of country. So I acknowledge and respect the traditional custodians of country and the connections to land, waters, and community. In particular, I acknowledge the Wadawurrung people on whose land I am currently on, and I pay respects to uh, elders past, present, and emerging. This land was never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I also like to acknowledge my own privileges as a cis, straight, white, able, thin-bodied, tertiary educated individual and acknowledge how these privileges shape the lens through which I see the world and therefore the content I'll be delivering today. So as I said before, my name is Nadia, and essentially the spiel I give clients when I'm working with them is that I've worked with a lot of people with challenging symptoms. So lots of pelvic pain, endometriosis, gut symptoms, and hormonal stuff. But I also work with a lot of people with a challenging relationship with food and their body. So I definitely don't take a eat this, don't eat this approach. It's more so how can I help you to improve those symptoms or reach your health goals whilst also having a happy relationship with food. And I think you'll probably get a little bit of a sense as to how I work out of this presentation. And so, who do I see when I'm working with clients? So, as mentioned, I see a lot of people with endo and pelvic pain, also disordered eating and eating disorders, PCOS and insulin resistance, IBS and digestive health, any kind of menstrual cycle related concerns or conditions, and then chronic illnesses, which includes things like POTS or orthostatic intolerance, hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos, chronic fatigue syndrome or ME, fibromyalgia, essentially lots of different acronyms, but if you know, you know. And then also I do a little bit of clinical hypnotherapy for clients for conditions like IBS and pain. Now, I regularly do a workshop for a pelvic pain clinic here in Victoria, but that workshop is actually 90 minutes long. So my challenge today is to fit the best bits of that presentation into roughly the next 20, 30 minutes or so, with the goal of giving you three key take-home messages. So let's get into it. So my three key take-home messages are: don't forget the basics, focus on what foods you can add in, and improve symptoms by coming at them from all angles. Now, that'll make a lot more sense shortly. There is so much I could have covered in this presentation. I'm sure you will be left with a lot of questions. You know, people often want to know about things like gluten or soy or supplements. There's always so much misinformation and conflicting information on the internet. But what I've tried to do with this presentation is just give the three top key take-home messages that will hopefully give you the biggest improvement in symptoms that I could actually generalize for everyone. Because as you probably all know, is that individualized information is best. But in the absence of the ability to do that in a presentation, I tried to give you the top three things that would hopefully help the most people. And if you have any questions left over, please feel free to reach out to me. My contact details will be on the last slide. So let's get into it. Now, when I start talking about nutrition for endometriosis or pelvic pain, I find myself both simultaneously wanting to advocate for the role of nutrition, but also not overplay its importance. Sadly, there are enough people online that are, spreading misinformation and saying things like changing your diet can cure endometriosis or totally heal pelvic pain. And as much as I really wish that were the case, sadly, that's not entirely true for most people. But in saying that, dietary changes can absolutely be helpful for people with pelvic pain. And so I want people to know that although the nutrition research is limited and characterized by a moderate to high risk of bias, as is most nutrition research, to be honest, we do have some very good evidence for it improving symptoms. So this little survey was done in 2017 and 484 people with endo in Australia, and they were asked to rate their self-management strategies for their pain. And dietary changes were actually the fourth most common strategy used in about 44% of people, and the third most effective for pain reduction, from memory coming behind, I think, heat and cannabis. So lots of people are doing it, and lots of people are finding it really helpful. And in saying that, nutrition is just one piece of the puzzle. People can really see great benefits, but it should be adjunct to supporting your body from all different angles and all different modalities. There's also no such thing as one perfect endo diet, despite what it might say online. The research just is not strong enough to support one way of eating. So there's no one size fits all. And when I'm talking to groups of people, I always say anything I say, try it on like a shoe, see if it fits. If it does, great. If it doesn't, leave it in the store, try a new shoe. And then lastly, how you feel about food is just as important as what you eat. So let's not forget that, yes, nutrition plays a beautiful role as fuel or nourishment, but it also plays a role in social health, celebration, nostalgia, all those other beautiful things. And I think if we're someone who experiences a lot of pain, then I think those things, having joy from food is so, so important to maintain. Now, historically, endometriosis or pelvic pain was thought as a very gynecological condition, but now we know it impacts the whole body and multiple systems, particularly the hormonal system, nervous system, digestive system, immune system, musculoskeletal system, and of course, psychosocial health. And so when we can harness the power of nutrition and dietary changes to support the health of all of these systems, particularly the nervous, immune, and endocrine or hormonal system when it comes to pain, and of course the gastrointestinal system when it comes to gut health, then this is how we can actually draw those links as to how nutrition can play a beautiful role in improving symptoms. Now, this is where I usually ask my first question to the workshop participants that I usually do this with. And that question, I would love for you to take a moment to think about it yourselves. That question is, when you think of nutrition advice for endometriosis or pelvic pain, what first comes to mind? So when I ask this question of groups, these are some of the things that first come to mind for people. Things like inflammatory foods or anti-inflammatory foods, maybe magnesium or certain nutrients. Maybe they've heard research about the Mediterranean diet, or often people are asking about gluten or dairy or even soy. Now, my mind goes here too. I think this is really normal because these are the things that we will most commonly hear about when it comes to endo. But what I find is that in the world of nutrition, we're always so zoomed in into the nitty gritty. It's the micronutrients or the vitamins or the minerals or the superfoods, right? Or the food groups. And I even do the same. Like when I'm deep in reading a paper about magnesium or zinc, for example, I'm kind of really down in that nitty gritty. But what I'm always trying to do is help myself and help my clients zoom out to begin with. All these things are lovely, and absolutely, I often discuss them at some point. But I actually see these as a little bit like they're kind of like the furnishings. And the analogy I use is like building a house. So if we're trying to go straight to these, it's almost like we're trying to build a house on a rocky foundation. So the first thing we want to do first is zoom out and get that foundation right so that house isn't going to fall down. And what I mean by the foundation is that first take home message is we're starting with the basics, and those basics is actually the regularity and adequacy of our eating. So I'm constantly coming back to, is this person in front of me eating enough, and are they eating regularly enough? Because this is actually going to make the most acute difference to someone's symptoms if this is an area that they need a little bit of work. And I'll explain why in a second, and I'll actually link it into the nervous system. But this is where I often ask my second question of the group, of whoever's watching. So definitely I'll ask you guys here, is that who here gets irritable or hangry if they go for too long without eating? Now, this is something I definitely raise my hand for. And this is why it's so important to talk about the foundations. So if we're going for a long period of time without eating, our blood sugars actually start to drop a little bit low. And our body sees that as quite dangerous, right? So, what it's going to do is it's going to send us this little surge of adrenaline, of stress hormones, and it will do that as a way to mobilize energy, essentially to help us to go find food. But depending on how connected we are with our body cues, with our hunger cues, we may or may not perceive that as go find food. We may more so perceive that as everyone's annoying me, or I'm too busy. I've got too much to do. I can't slow down. I can't stop to eat. So if you said yes to getting hungry, that's fight energy. Sorry, hangry, hangry or irritable, fight energy. And or the other one is the flight energy. So that's the so busy, I can't stop to eat. And then often when we find we eat something, it's like, oh, things aren't so bad. Now, this fight or flight energy is actually what I call our meerkat state. So we're on edge, we're actually looking for danger. It's kind of what we call hypervigilance. Now, this is all well and good to be in this occasionally. We have a meeting that goes over time, we miss a meal, we accidentally miss a snack, that's fine. But if we're someone that has quite inconsistent intake, or we're quite often going for too long without eating, we will constantly be pushed up into this fight or flight response because of that extra little adrenaline surge, which is really not something we want when we're someone who deals with pelvic pain or gut symptoms. Because what happens is in that hyperarousal state, our resilience to pain really drops down, our resilience to stress. We actually get more bloated rather than less. And we can even get things like nausea and definitely low energy levels. So, this is where I will always start with clients. And that's where the next question often comes, which is, what does this actually mean? What does this look like? So, something I go by is something called the flexible rule of threes. So, 3 meals, 2 to 3 snacks, roughly every 3 to 4 hours, ideally starting within an hour or so of waking up. So, what that looks like is ideally a balanced breakfast, possibly a morning tea, ideally a lunch, usually an afternoon tea, ideally dinner, and then possibly an evening snack if desired. Now, it's really flexible because this will probably look a little bit differently to everyone based on someone's schedule. So, if someone's getting up quite late, they're getting up at 8, breakfast by 9, yeah, they might not need a morning tea. Then we'll just be doing lunch, afternoon tea, dinner, evening snack if desired. Now, someone's getting up quite early, they're getting up at 6 a.m., breakfast by 7. I would definitely be wanting a morning tea in there because 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, it's going a bit too long without food if we're following that 3 to 4 hour rule. So, morning tea, lunch, afternoon tea, dinner, evening snack if desired. Now, often people will say, well, what if I'm not hungry? Shouldn't I just be following my hunger cues? And yes, absolutely. Following our hunger cues is kind of end goal. I would really love people to be in touch with their hunger cues and following those. And what I will say is that I see a lot of people that have become quite out of sync with those hunger cues, and that can happen for a number of reasons. It can be that we're living really busy lives, and when we're so busy or even so stressed, those appetite cues can get quite suppressed, or maybe we're drinking coffee and that's suppressing those hunger cues. Or it can be that our bodies are just like a really painful or scary place to be in, particularly if our symptoms or our pain has been ignored for so long. It can make sense that we would really disconnect from our body cues. So, if in doubt, I always say, let's try this flexible rule of threes for 3 to 4 weeks and actually notice in your own body whether that you see improvements in energy, improvements in mood, improvements in overall well-being. And that will be a really good indication as to whether we were, impacting our nervous system by inconsistency in eating. And then the goal would be to kind of honor those hunger cues once we're back in touch with them. The other thing about this is it's a really lovely opportunity to get in more anti-inflammatory foods. If we're only eating 2 meals a day, then it's really hard to get all the wonderful nutrients in that I'm about to talk about shortly. So this is always where I start. Now you'll notice down here at where it says snacks, I say 2 to 3 foods. And what I actually mean by that is something called a buddy system approach to snacks. So snacks are a lot happier when they're buddied up because when we can combine a couple of food groups, ideally, it actually supports more satiation and supports more stable blood sugars. I don't know if you've ever, say, eaten an apple and been like, "Ugh, I'm more hungry than I was before I ate the apple." So what we really want to do is we want to support that satiation and satisfaction. especially if we're someone who struggles with instability in our blood sugar. So whether we have something like a condition like PCOS or a chronic invisible illness, this can be really important. And so there's a couple of examples of what that might look like. So it can be things like a nut bar and fruit, trail mix and berries, yogurt, nuts, crackers, dip, you know, bliss balls and berries, or egg, goat's cheese, something like that. So I actually have a free handout on my website that you can check out, which has a few more ideas in it as well. But this is kind of the basics. And after we've gone through the basics, we then will move towards anti-inflammatory eating. Now, I personally like to also focus on the addition of nutrients. So what are we adding in as opposed to what we're taking away? And I definitely do this when I'm speaking to groups of people. So a while back, I Googled endo diet just to see what would come up. I was really intrigued. And these are the top four results from Google. And you'll see on the top left-hand side, the top results has 8 tips for eating for endo. And what you'll notice is that 5 out of those 8 tips are actually to avoid or exclude or eliminate certain foods. So, and you'll see from the other ones as well, it's very black and white. It's like eat, don't eat, avoid, eliminate. It's really all or nothing. And as someone who has seen people develop quite disordered eating or a lot of fear around food, just from trying to improve their gut symptoms or trying to improve their pain, these kinds of good bad lists really stress me out because, you know, besides it leaves us being like, well, what do I actually eat? If you're telling me to cut all these things out, what do I add in? And so that's why I always take the approach of adding in, especially when talking to groups of people, because I don't know what people's relationships with food are like. So when we're looking at adding in, just a quick overview of some of the research. So this was one research study done in people with endo. It was a Mediterranean diet research study in 68 people. Look, it's not perfect. It was only single arm, so there was no control group. But what they did was they had the dietary intervention of including fresh vegetables, fruit, white meat, fish rich in fat, soy products, wholemeal products, foods rich in magnesium and cold pressed oils, and asked people to avoid sugary drinks, red meats, sweets, and animal fats. And the results they found was that there's a significant relief in general pain, period pain, pain when urinating, pain when passing a bowel motion, and overall well-being. So this is one example of research that shows how dietary changes can make a difference in symptoms. We also have some research that whereby people had similar changes in their nutrition, and we actually saw a improvement in their body's ability to handle inflammation when we were looking at inflammatory markers in people with endo. So we know that it can actually improve symptoms making dietary changes, but it can also improve inflammation in the body at the same time. So that's probably why those symptoms are improving. Now, there's lots more research I could go into, but for the sake of time, I will just jump straight into anti-inflammatory eating. You know what? It is not rocket science. I think a lot of people would know this already. So we're looking at things like nourishing fats and omega-3s. We're looking at whole grains, particularly for their fiber content. We're also looking at lots of colorful foods that contain plenty of antioxidants and polyphenols, as well as a few functional foods. And we're also looking at hydration and that the role hydration plays in things like energy and pain. And there are definitely some supplements that have been studied in endometriosis, which I always recommend seeking individualized advice for. Now, I am a very visual person, so when I'm talking about making these changes with in the workshop or with clients, I'm often using pictures. So, as a few examples, we will be looking at things like nourishing fats, so things like extra virgin olive oil, avocado, nuts and nut butters, and seeds. Seeds are definitely undereaten in our society, so using things like chia seeds, pumpkin seeds, sunflower seeds, and ground flax seeds can be an awesome way to get in plenty of quality nutrients like vitamin E and zinc and other things. And there's a little fun fact down the bottom which says that extra virgin olive oil contains a substance called oleocanthal, which shares unique perceptual and anti-inflammatory characteristics with ibuprofen. So essentially, extra virgin olive oil is like a little natural anti-inflammatory. And then we might look at things like polyphenols. Now, polyphenols they contain antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties, and they're often found in all of our beautiful, colorful foods. So they're found in so many different foods, but these are the ones that you're going to get the most bang for your buck for in terms of how many polyphenols there'll be in there. So these are things like berries, red cabbage, grapes, beetroot, so those rich colors. Also things like citrus fruits and kiwi fruit. Definitely herbs and spices, especially things like turmeric, rosemary, sage, and thyme. Tea, particularly green tea and matcha, which has some other added benefits. Extra virgin olive oil again, and then cocoa and dark chocolate. And I guess when we're looking at the research, is that for some of these foods in endometriosis, they've actually taken out certain compounds, polyphenolic compounds, like you probably heard of resveratrol and quercetin. And so these are little supplements that have been extracted from these foods and have some research in endometriosis. But you can get some of those polyphenols from these foods. So this is a really great place to start. And then lastly, when we're looking at fiber, my favorite type of fiber is actually called soluble fiber. So I don't know how many people have used something like psyllium husk before. And what it does is it forms this lovely gel-like matrix when you add it to water. And so soluble fiber is really beautiful at, yes, supporting our bowels. So it helps the health of our gut bacteria by giving them nutrition, and then they in turn give us immune modulating compounds, so they really support our immune system. It also helps our stool consistency. So if we suffer with constipation or diarrhea, fiber can be one thing that we add in to help that. But it also helps modulate any toxins or excess hormones in our body. So I mentioned that lovely gel-like matrix that you see in something like psyllium husk. That is really good at binding toxins or excess hormones from our body, including supporting the clearance of something like estrogen. So some of these foods that contain soluble fiber are the flesh of all our fruit and veggies, things like bananas, oats, avocado, legumes are also really under-eaten in our society, and they have beautiful fiber in them. And then we can look at something like a supplement like psyllium husk or partially hydrolyzed guar gum as an alternative as well. So that is a really brief summary of anti-inflammatory eating, which was my second take home message. And then my third one that we're moving on to is improving symptoms by coming at them from all angles. Now, first and foremost, I always like to say that we want to rule out any underlying conditions, because what we know is that people with endometriosis are also more likely to have other immune related conditions, one such being celiac disease. So I always want to make sure that if my clients have some really tricky or concerning symptoms, that they're getting other conditions ruled out first by their medical doctor. And often by the time my clients come to see me, they've often had all the tests under the sun in their kind of journey to getting their diagnosis or suspected diagnosis, or even just support for their pelvic pain. So by that time, then they might come to me and we're looking at, okay, how can we improve their gut symptoms? Now, what we know is that 85 to 90% of people with endometriosis have gut symptoms, and they've got about 3 times the risk of the general population of having IBS. So it's extremely common in this population. The most common symptoms are bloating, could be constipation, diarrhea, or mixed bowel. So they can go either way, and also often abdominal discomfort or pain as well. Now, there are actually a number of reasons why someone with endo might have gut symptoms. It can definitely be endometriosis on the bowel, but that's definitely not the only reason. We also look at things like inflammation, because the pelvis is such a little jam-packed sandwich down there, but the inflammation that might impact the area around the uterus, fallopian tubes, ovaries can also impact nearby structures like the bowel and the bladder. Also crosstalk between nerves. And then we also know people with endo have differences in their gut microbiome, or their gut bugs, right? So there's actually lots of different reasons, and that's probably part of a bigger presentation. But I'll just get straight into the juicy stuff as to how we can support someone with gut symptoms and pain by looking at it from multiple angles. And I do that by sharing my favorite analogy for supporting people with this, and that is called the bucket analogy. So if we picture ourselves as a bit like a bucket and say an overflowing bucket equals the symptoms we're experiencing, like gut symptoms like pain, most people will come and see me and say, "What's filling up my bucket?" i.e., what foods or drinks are causing these symptoms? And I'll say, yes, I'm more than happy to consider that. Sometimes food intolerances are part of the picture. But I also want to know what's shrinking your bucket and making you so much more sensitive to things. And how do we help you expand your bucket? So ideally, you can actually tolerate most foods, most drinks without issue. So there are commonalities which fall into either side. So what might fill up someone's bucket are common things like lactose for some people, or FODMAPs, which can include things like gluten or fructans, caffeine, alcohol are some really common ones. And then what impacts the size of someone's bucket will be things like health conditions, their emotional well-being, stress, stages of their menstrual cycle. Are they eating regularly? Are they eating enough? It's not rocket science, is it? It's sleep, it's movement, it's our pelvic floor, it's other influences like how we go to the bathroom, and medications and supplements. So, just as a little example as to what this might look like when I'm working with someone, is that someone might come to me and say, "Okay, I know I have issues with too much lactose, right? And I know I have issues with alcohol. It does not do good things for my body." And then they might also say, "And I think there's something going on with maybe gluten, or we might wonder if it's fructans, which is another compound in wheat, barley, and rye. And maybe it's when I eat too much pasta or I eat too much bread, I really don't feel good in my tummy." It's like, okay, so we put a question mark next to that. And then we look at what's impacting the size of their bucket. So, hey, maybe they have endometriosis, or we definitely suspect some inflammation, right? That'll be impacting the bowel and symptoms. They also might notice there are these connections with their menstrual cycle as to when their symptoms are the worst. Like they might get diarrhea on day one of their period, for example, if they're having a period. Or even when people are sometimes on hormonal therapies, they can still notice these fluctuations across the roughly 4 weeks of the cycle. We often also suspect some pelvic floor dysfunction, and hopefully a pelvic floor physio might be doing a presentation, but I'll be screening for things like when bowels feel incomplete, or maybe there's straining, or some other things that can indicate pelvic floor dysfunction, or often a tight pelvic floor. Stress is often a part of the picture, or our emotional well-being or our nervous system. And then maybe they also have really inconsistent eating patterns. So, keeping all of this in mind, what I might do with someone, and obviously I wouldn't do all of this in a single session, but some of the things we might look at to keep it nice and holistic and targeting it from all angles are things like referring to a pelvic health physio, maybe even doing a little few toileting tips. So, making sure people are using a toilet stool when they're opening their bowels to support their pelvic floor and reduce the risk of kind of incomplete emptying or straining. We might be looking at maybe tracking their patterns and their symptoms across the menstrual cycle. Definitely regular and adequate eating to improve things like bowels and bloating. Looking at nervous system support, and there are so many different ways to do that. Obviously, one of my favorite would be hypnotherapy, or even things like guided meditation. Anti-inflammatory eating options to support the inflammation, and maybe give or take some supplements there. And then we might also look at that possible trigger reduction as to what might be impacting their symptoms. But I guess the goal of targeting it from different angles is that then all the burden doesn't fall on food intolerances or eliminating food, because we can help expand the bucket so we're not so sensitive to food and have to remove everything from our life. So the idea is when we increase the size of our bucket, we can usually tolerate most foods with time. Remembering that bodies can take a while to heal, but that's often the direction that we're moving in. And with time, ideally, you should be able to tolerate most foods. So those are my three take-home messages. So we're looking at starting with the basics: regularity and adequacy, adding in some beautiful anti-inflammatory foods and ideally making it fun and tasty, and then also improving symptoms, particularly gut symptoms, by coming at it from all angles. So we're hopefully not having to just do strict elimination diets. Thank you all for your time today. I hope you enjoyed it. You can get in touch with me via my email, my Instagram at Nadia Maxwell Nutrition, or my website, which are all listed on the screen. I see lots of people with endo and pelvic pain, and bookings can be made via my website. And I also have an online course called Nourish for Endometriosis, which supports you to look at and take that whole body holistic approach through food and other modalities. And that's self-paced, so you can do it in your own time. Thank you so much for your time today.